let's go. Batter up. We're taking the afternoon off. It's a beautiful day for a ball game, today. The fans are out to get a ticket or two. From Walla Walla, Washington to Kalamazoo. It's a beautiful day for a home run, but even a triple's okay. We're gonna cheer and boo and raise a hullabaloo at the ball.
This episode of A Conversation with John Conenna is sponsored by Generate. In today's digital age, staying ahead means harnessing the power of generative AI. Wondering how your small or medium-sized business can join this revolution? Look no further than Generate, your strategic partner for integrating cutting-edge generative AI solutions. We create personalized plans, adapting existing AI technologies to fit your specific business needs. Plus, our expert team provides essential training, empowering you to make the most of these innovative technologies. Interested in transforming your business with AI? Reach out to us at generateteam@gmail.com. That's generate, GENERAIT, team@gmail.com. And now, on with the episode.
Good evening and welcome to another edition of A Conversation with John Conenna. Tonight it brings me really great pleasure because this gentleman will be his third time on my show. We were just talking about that before the camera went on. We are talking about a great author here in Chicago, a gentleman that's wrote a few books. One of them, of course, is The Streets of the Near West Side, winning political campaigns and celebrating a proud past. And he's also edited books, the essays and Earl Renfro, A Man of First. I have to tell you, the book, though, that I love that he wrote, and that's what captured me to check him out, is this great book that I keep reading over and over again. It's The Forgotten 1970 Chicago Cubs Go and Glow by William. It's just a great book. I love it. It's still available. I know it's still available. I went to I think it was a Barnes and Noble, and of course you can get this still bill on Amazon. He is also, besides being a great author, the senior vice president at A&B Communications. And of course, Bill has been one of the leading communications at my old alma mater, Loyola University, won many awards.
For 10 years, yeah.
Yep, Peter Lisgore Awards, top honors, over 50 awards in the Chicagoland area. So I could stay a half hour just on the intro, Bill, because the intro is fantastic. But again, what a great author, just great person, a specialist in communications. Bill William Vike. What is going on with you, young man, besides that great introduction?
That was one of the best introductions I ever had, John. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And, when I wrote my book about the 1970 Chicago Cubs, I went to a website called What If Sports, where you can run fantasy games.
Yes.
And I ran a fantasy World Series between the 1970 Cubs and the 1970 Baltimore Orioles. And, whichever way it turned out would have been fine with me. And it turned out that according to the computer, and computers don't lie, right?
No.
the Cubs would have beat the Orioles in the World Series in 5 games. So I went to What If Sports to take a look at what would have happened if the Chicago Cubs and the Chicago White Sox had played in the 1964 World Series. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight.
Yes. And you know what? We're going to talk about the 1964 season. Bill and I have touched on this before we went on the camera a couple of times. For the National Leaguers that year, it looked like the Philadelphia Phillies were going to win the division with, 6. I think there was, they had a lead with either 6 or 12 to play. They
were 6.5 games ahead with about 2 weeks to play. And an interesting thing happened. They ended up with a 10-game losing streak, and that turned the race into complete disarray. They were sailing along. And what happened was they were playing the Cincinnati Reds, and it was a scoreless tie. And Chico Ruiz, who was a pretty fast guy, was on third base. Frank Robinson, their best hitter, was at the plate. You never steal home with your best hitter at the plate, right? Well, Chico Ruiz took it upon himself to steal home. While Frank Robinson was standing there, he was safe. The Reds won the game 1-0. and that shook up the Phillies so much that they ended up losing 10 games in a row. So,
Wow.
they
And
were.
Bill, thanks for bringing that up, because you talk about something could just swing something, and that swung it into the wrong direction. And again, that was a great team with Philadelphia. I mean, they had the great, at that time, we could call him the great Johnny Callison, who won, I think, the 1964 All-Star game with a home run. And Richie Allen, of course, was on that team. Bobby Wine, Cookie Rojas, great pitching staff. I mean, there were some great players on that team. And of course, they wind up finishing behind the St. Louis Cardinals, 92-70, that infamous 1969 record of the Chicago Cubs.
But that's a good analogy there, John.
Oh, geez. 92-70. When I saw that, I go, oh, William. And of course, the Cubs that year wound up, who we're going to talk about, in 8th at 76-86. And then, of course, on the south side of time, which I wish we could have, if there was such thing as a home equity loan for wins, I wish the 2024 team could have went back to 64 to grab about 20 of these, because the Chicago White Sox wound up one game behind the New York Yankees.
The National League had an interesting pennant race, perhaps one of the most interesting ones ever, but the American League did too. And what happened was the Yankees finished first, winning 99 games. The Sox won 98. The Baltimore Orioles won 97. So it was a 3-team race.
Yes.
And for most of the season, it was the Orioles and the White Sox that were jockeying back and forth for first place. And the Yankees really came on at the end, to end up winning the thing. But a key statistic that year is that the Sox were 6-12 against the Yankees. And so if the Sox would have won just one of those games, the Sox would have won the pennant and the Yankees would have finished second. And, a few of those games were like really close. So, for example, on June 14th, the Yankees beat the Sox 4-3, but the Sox were up in the 9th inning of the second game of the doubleheader then, and ended up losing the game. And in the first game, the Sox had one of their best pitchers going, Juan Pizarro, against a guy named Bud Daly, who was just a journeyman. And everybody expected Pizarro to win that game, and because Daly was washed up, and Daly ended up winning that game. So that was a doubleheader that they could have won that they lost. And then just about a week later, they had a 1-0 loss against the Yankees in the 11th inning. So the game was scoreless until the 11th. Sox could have won that one, anytime. And then the next day, the Yankees beat the White Sox 2-1 in 17 innings. So any one of those games, the Sox could have easily won, and they didn't, and that would have been done for.
I mean, what a great, here's the thing, I'm 65 years old and I'm listening to you, and I say, I've said to a lot of people, don't worry about it. When it comes to both of these teams, don't worry about it. It's April. So they went on a 5-game lose. It's only April. But the way you just depicted that, every game is, it's like a consequence. Everything is a consequence.
They were all in June. So if the Sox would have won any one of those games, they'd have won the pennant, and that would have been it.
Wow. Let's go over to the north side before we get it.
Okay.
What do you recollect of that? Of course, a lot of crazy things happen. And we know the one thing that would really happen, and I'll bring up the analogy of that one. I want your answer on this. Of course, the year before, just before that season starts, we lose a great second baseman.
And that's why I think that if Ken Hubbs, who was the Cubs' great second baseman, he was Rookie of the Year, he was a fantastic fielder. If he would not have perished in a plane crash that winter, that's why I think the Cubs actually could have won the pennant in '64. And it sounds crazy to talk about a team that was 10 games under like that. But number one, if Hubbs would have been in the lineup, that would have made a big difference. Number two, if Hubbs was in the lineup, then the Cubs never trade Lou Brock, because their 1-2 punch would have been Hubbs leading off, or Brock leading off, and Hubbs hitting right behind him, and then Williams, Sano, and Banks. It was a fantastic hitting lineup. It was just a terrific lineup. Now in '63, the Cubs, most people think that, between 45 and 67, the Cubs were never any good. But in '63, the Cubs 500, and they had incredible pitching. Their top two pitchers were Dick Ellsworth and Larry Jackson. And they finished in '63, they finished second in the league in ERA, second in giving up the fewest runs, second in earned runs, second in walks. They had a fantastic pitching staff. So think about 64 with Hubs on the team. There's no way that the Cubs push the panic button and trade Lou Brock. So then you've got, the great lineup, and there's no reason to think that the Cubs wouldn't have improved in 63. And so the Cardinals that year, since the Phillies collapse, ended up winning the pennant with only 93 victories. So, which was kind of low in those days. We
Sure.
see teams, with numbers like that now or below, but back then, everybody won 95, 100, something like that. So, could the Cubs have won like 93 or 94 with Lou Brock in the lineup, with Ken Hubs in the lineup, and after, having had a good season before? I mean, absolutely. So,
Absolutely.
the combo of, having Brock and Hubs in the lineup and, kind of a pennant race where, nobody was really that good, I think the Cubs could have done it if Ken Hubs would have lived.
And when you said that 1-2 punch about, with Hubs and Brock, do you compare it basically the Bill to, like, say, Denier and Sandberg?
Oh yeah. Because, Brock and Brock had his breakout season in 64 with unfortunately with the Cardinals.
The Cardinals, yeah.
Yeah. And so, Brock would have been a guy who got on base, all the time, Hubs driving him over. And then you've got the order, Williams, Sano, and Banks. So, you could easily see, leading off, Brock gets on base, steals second, Hubs gets him over to third with a hit or a bunt or something like that, and then Williams, Sano, and Banks come up. This team would have been a scoring machine. There's no two ways about it.
Exactly. Bill, I got to ask you, because I wasn't too familiar with that time. Did Brock play 1 or 2 years with the Cubs?
Let me.
I just didn't do the research on it. I want. Did he come up in 63?
Yeah, so Brock actually came up in 61 in September.
Okay.
And then he played the whole season in 62 and 63. And so he stole 24 bases in 63. He stole 43 in 64. That was his breakout season. But his 63 was pretty good too. He had 258. I mean, it wasn't fantastic, but it wasn't bad. So, I mean, Brock by this time was a young veteran, and he was doing okay, and he would have done even better in 64.
And Bill, from what I remember from box scores, it looks like Brock was in left and Billy Williams was in right.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't recollect it. Of course, when he leaves, Williams moves to left. Right. All right.
Yeah. Brock was actually not the Cubs center fielder. Now, I figured that the 64 lineup would have been a little different. I would have had Billy in left, Brock in right, and a guy named Bill Burton in center field. He didn't do much, but there are guys like that on pennant winning teams who, don't really do much. And they used to say back then, if a guy played in the World Series, it would add 5 years to his career. So, we haven't heard too much about guys like Bill Burton. But he probably would have done okay in the 60s had he been in the World Series in 64.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. And then, of course, not to put a knock on, of course, my Italian heritage, but Joey Malfitano replaces Hubs, I think, then next year. And of course, Joey Malfitano is basically a journeyman player, correct?
Yeah, exactly. He'd been around. He came up with the Giants in 54. So by that time, he'd been around for 10 years. He hadn't really established himself as a regular. So, and the Cubs had to put him at second because they needed somebody, but he was not Ken Hubs. Another thing with Hubs, he was a tall guy too. You think of middle infielders as usually like short, fast guys. Hubs was a tall guy, but that kind of made him almost like a short center in Chicago softball, because Hubs really could cover a lot of ground. And so there were balls that would get by other guys that just wouldn't get by Hubs, because A, he was a good fielder, and B, he was tall enough to reach some balls that other guys wouldn't have gotten.
I got to ask you something. Maybe you can answer this question. Let's say, the destiny of our life, Hubs, that doesn't happen to Kenny Hubs. Is Glenn Beckert not even a name in Chicago, or is he a backup?
Oh, yeah, because the Cubs got Beckert from the Red Sox organization. So, if you got Ken Hubs and Paul Popovich, who we remember, as a super sub, he actually came up in the Cub organization, and they traded him to the Dodgers, and then they got him back for 69 when Beckert got hurt. But yeah, I don't even think Glenn Beckert becomes a Cub then. I think, with Ken Hubbs, and then with Paul Popovich as the young guy to be the utility infielder, I think we never see Beckert in Chicago.
At all. I got to go back over to the South Side because, when I saw that they won 98 games, I went and looked at just the beginning lineup.
Yeah.
And I think you're going to remember some of these names. Jim Landis was in center, and of course, he had to be up in age already. Don Buford, who went on to have Baltimore fame, was playing second base, not left field, like he did in the 69-70 World Series.
Yeah.
Then they had this guy, Floyd Robinson, who was in right. They had Dave Nicholson, who had the roof shot in the old park.
Yeah.
Joe Cunningham, who was pretty much from the Cardinals, he had to be pretty much on his last legs too.
Yeah.
And then, of course, Ronnie Hansen was at short, and they had Charlie
Hansen had a really good year that year. We think of him as kind of a good field, no hit type of guy, but for a light hitting team, I mean, the Sox only hit 247 that year, which was good for sixth place in the 10-team league, but their pitching was fantastic. They were first in the league in shutouts, walks, fewest hits, runs, earned runs, fewest walks given up. I mean, their pitching was fantastic. They had Gary Peters, they had Juan Pizarro, they had Joe Horlin, they had John Buzzard, who was a veteran. And their relievers too. Hoyt Wilhelm ended up
coming out of the bullpen,
he was their closer. Eddie Fisher was their setup man. The pitching staff was just fantastic, which is why some of those games against the Yankees, like I mentioned, were like 1-0 and stuff, because the Sox, not only could hold the Yankee hitters, to one run, but unfortunately their own hitters didn't really do too much.
Right. I mean, and just to hear these scores, Bill, and knowing that they had that lineup that they had, I think your favorite was on that 64 Yankee team, Joe Pepitone, and of course Mickey Mantle. We can't forget about Mickey Mantle. I mean, they had some guys. I think Tony Kubek was still playing then.
Oh yeah, Tony Kubek was playing, and what was interesting is that they made a late season acquisition, so late that he couldn't play in the World Series. Pedro Ramos, the pitcher for the Washington Senators, and they used him out of the bullpen in September. And in September, I think their record was like 18-10. That's why they came up at the end and ended up winning. And Ramos was their closer for like 3 weeks and really pitched them to the pennant. So they couldn't use him in the actual World Series, but he got him there anyway. And you see guys like that from time to time.
Before we go into this little thing that we're going to do with the Cubs and the Sox here, I'll never forget this. I had a VHS tape that I found at a Jewel, and they interviewed Al Lopez in this little documentary of the White Sox up until 1973. And Lopez says, and I know a William Bike's going to correct me if it's wrong. He says, we were one game out with 10 games left. The Yankees won 10 straight. To go back to you where if the White Sox could have just won the one game, we went 9-1 in that stretch of the last games. They went 10-0. We went 9-1. He says, and we lost the pennant.
No, I think he's actually right about that. That year.
I mean, that is bone chilling for me for a Chicago team to do good in September.
Yeah. But the Sox were in first place as late as September 6th. And 2 weeks before the end of the season, they were only a half game back. Actually, I misspoke. The Sox had a strong September at 18-10, but the Yanks won 21 out of 25.
Boy, incredible.
So they win 10 in a row, and the Sox 9-1. Yeah, I won't disagree with the Serene Senor, as they used to call him.
Yeah, El Senor Lopez, El Senor. Yes.
But it's like the Sox did great, and unfortunately the Yankees did better.
Well, with everything that we've set up here just now in this little conversation about what could have been what, and by the way, Brock gets traded in June of 64 that summer, correct, for Brulio?
Yeah, it was like late May, early June, something like that. I think it was late May, but yeah, the Cubs were like something like 15-25, 15-30, and so management pushed the panic button and they traded for Brulio, which, oddly, although it's considered the worst trade in Major League history, was actually considered a steal for the Cubs at the time, because Brolio had won 18 games like 2 years before, and Brock, as we saw, was about a 250 hitter. And so they were able to trade a 250 hitting outfielder for a a pitcher who'd won 18 only a couple of years before, but Brolio had a sore arm, never did anything for the Cubs. And
Yeah.
Brock had his breakout season in 64, and he was already doing okay when they traded him. And then he caught fire when he's with the Cardinals.
I read something that in 65, 66, Brolio's ERA with the Cubs was a 6 point something. And the rumor was, because we didn't know the terminology then, he might have had the Tommy John injury.
Yeah. And Tommy John surgery didn't come in until the 70s. That's where they take a piece of the other arm and they put in the pitcher's,
Sure.
arm. And when that happened with Tommy John, I mean, they had no idea if it would work, because it had never been tried before. And Tommy John not only did great with the Dodgers after he had that surgery, but he even went on to pitch in the World Series for the Yankees too, because the Yankees have always, gone about acquiring the best guys available because they
they have always found a way, right, Bill? They've always.
Anyway,
so let's take the scenario. By the way, I'm going to just pause it here for a minute in a little bit of the conversation. We are visiting, of course, with William Bike, the great author, of course, an A&B, the vice president and senior vice president at A&B Communications. Just a fine gentleman who has done so well with communications here in the city and so many things that he's done. We're visiting about the 1964 season of the White Sox, who came in second place, and the Chicago Cubs that played eighth. And Bill would like to kind of break down now what would have happened if these two would have met in a World Series, because the Cubs made some bad moves, and there was an unfortunate thing with Ken Hubbs that we brought up, the second baseman who died in the plane crash. So let's start with this. We'll say that the White Sox had the better record. So opening game, Comiskey Park, 35th and Shields.
Actually, the first game would have been at Wrigley Field because
would have been.
Because the National League had the first two, the American League had the middle three, and then the National League had the games 6 and 7 too.
No, and Bill, it didn't matter what the record was during the regular season?
No, it's just they switched off from year to year. So in so even numbered years, the National League got the 4 games, and in odd number years, the American League got the 4 games.
Okay, so now let's correct me.
So the record, didn't happen until a few years ago. They decided to do it, by the All-Star game. I think they've dialed that back since then. But yeah, it just used to switch off every year. So that year it would have opened at beautiful Wrigley Field on October 7th.
30 p.m. Yep.
It was 64 degrees, a little bit cloudy, 29 mile an hour wind. And that would have been the first World Series game at Wrigley Field in 19 years. And first World Series game between the Cubs and the Sox since October 14th, 1906, which would have been 58 years before. Wow. So the Cubs starter would have been the lefty Dick Ellsworth.
Okay.
And so the Sox manager, Al Lopez, would have played his typical lineup against lefties. Leading off was center fielder Mike Hirschberger, who only batted .230 that year. But despite his light hitting, he was a good fielder. And so he was a starter with the Sox and the Kansas City and Oakland A's for about 7 years in the 1960s. So for a .230 hitter, he did okay. And so batting second would have been one of their better hitters, right fielder Floyd Robinson, who batted .301. 2 years earlier, he'd led the league with 45 doubles, so he was a good hitter. Next was shortstop Ron Hansen, like we talked about. He had his best batting average of the year of his career in 1964 with a .261 average. So he often batted third. Sometimes he even batted cleanup that year, like I mentioned before. Now, John, a guy you hadn't mentioned before, but who would have been their starting first baseman was Bill Skowron, Moose Skowron.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. And he was their cleanup hitter. They got him from the Washington Senators that July, and he batted .293 since the trade for the Sox. So he was definitely their top hitter. So the next guy was their third baseman, Pete Ward, who batted .282 that year. Tom McCraw was the left fielder. Alan Weiss was their second baseman that year after Kelly Fox was traded. So, Weiss, we think of him as one of the guys who got the Mets over the line in 1969, but he's with the White Sox, batted .247, stole 22 bases. And so, he was pretty good too. Now, not too well remembered was the Sox catcher, a guy named Camilo Carrion. Carrion played only 37 games in the regular season because actually J.C. Martin did most of the catching.
Yeah, he was the main guy there. Yes.
Yeah. But Martin's average for the whole year was 197. And so Carrion was the guy that the Sox played down the stretch in September, and he batted 274. And so he would have been the guy who was in there. And so the Sox starter would have been their ace, Gary Peters, who was a 20 game winner that year. So you had
was he the main guy, Bill? Excuse me.
He was the main guy. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and it's interesting. There's a friend of mine who was a big Sox fan in the 60s, and we still have this argument today. It's like, who was their number one guy? Was it Juan Pizarro or Gary Peters? So I say Pizarro, but my buddy says Gary Peters. And, Peters was was the ace that year. He was, although Pizarro, overall had some good years and made the All-Star game. But
sure.
Yeah, Gary Peters would have got it. So for the Cubs, Lou Brock would have led off, in right field. Ken Hubbs would have been second, as we talked about. Billy Williams third. He batted 312 that year with 33 homers, 98 RBI. It's a very good season. Ron Santo batted cleanup with a 313 average, major league leading 13 triples. Led the National League in walks with 86. Had a 398 on base percentage to lead the league as well. So you see, even though in real life these guys finished pretty low in the standings, they had some good seasons that year. Sure. Ernie Banks would have been batting fifth. He batted only 264 that year, but he had 23 homers and 95 RBI. And then after that, the quality falls off a little. The catcher would have been Dick Bertel, a guy not too well remembered. He batted 230 that year. Guy I mentioned before, center fielder Ellis Burton was even worse. He batted only 190. He's in the line for his glove. And Andre Rogers was the shortstop, and he batted 239. So running the Cubs was Bob Kennedy, whose title was head coach. It wasn't
head coach. Was he part of that college of coaches?
He was part of the college of coaches, but by that time they weren't really having the college anymore. They had settled on Kennedy. They still called them head coach. Although when Leo DeRocher got hired for 1966, he made a point of saying, "I'm not the head coach, I'm the manager." But Kennedy was considered the head coach, but he was, for all intents and purposes, the manager.
So, got it. So he was the main guy there. Yeah. Yes.
So that's the lineup. And so, to give you a little play-by-play that What If Sports came up with in the bottom of the first, Lou Brock did exactly what he was supposed to do. He got a base hit to right. Then he stole second. Catcher Camilo Carrion made an errant throw sailing into center field. So Brock took third. And so after Hubbs and Williams made out, Peters threw a wild pitch. Even though he's a great pitcher, sometimes guys in the World Series are a little nervous. And so threw a pitch, Brock scored. That rattled him a little bit, gave up a triple to Sano, intentionally walked Banks, but then he hit Bertel in the leg with a pitch to load the bases, and then Burton singled to left, and so the Cubs would have had a surprising 3-0 first inning lead off of Peters. So rest of the day, the Sox would get their hits, but they'd end up stranding runners all day long. I just want to give you a little other play-by-play that's important. So by the bottom of the seventh, the Cubs would have been up 6-0.
Oh wow!
Bill Williams singled, and then the moment that Cub fans had waited for all of their lives happened. Ernie Banks smacked a 2-run homer over the left field.
Of course.
and the Cubs had an 8-0 lead. And then they actually, the computer has them scoring a few more runs and ended up winning 12-0. Now, this is, on the one hand, unexpected since the Sox were known for their stingy pitching. But if you remember, that's exactly what happened in the 1959 World Series when the Sox won the opening game 11-0.
Right, with early win.
And the Dodgers had the fantastic pitching. And so, these weird things, just happen in the World Series sometimes. So, Ellsworth pitched kind of a sloppy shutout because he gave up 10 hits, but the Sox couldn't put anybody across. And so the Cubs ended up winning the game 12-0. And so that was game number 1.
Wow. Okay. Just to get ahead of this a little bit, what is how many games, without calling the winner yet, how many games is this series going?
Ends up going 7 games.
It goes 7 games.
It goes 7 games, yeah. And so, that surprised me because, like I said, when I ran the fantasy World Series between the Orioles and the Cubs in 1970. That one only won 5, but these guys really went back and forth. So in game 2, so that was the Sox. So basically what happened, Bill Skowron led off the second inning with a solo home run. Absolutely believable because he was their guy that year. Hirschberger hit a double to center, and Pizarro kept the inning alive by getting hit by a pitch, and then McCraw smoked the line drive, single to right, and the Sox had a 2-0 lead. And so basically, this was a classic 1964 White Sox game because first you had let's see who pitched. Yeah, Juan Pizarro pitched that game, and you had Eddie Fisher come in to pitch for the Sox in the bottom of the 8th. He was their setup man, and then closer Hoyt Wilhelm came in the bottom of the 9th. Cubs pounded out 14 hits on the day. I mean, the Cubs had the great hitters, but these guys shut them down when it counted, and the Sox won that game 4-2. So now
4-2. Okay, so now they got the split in Wrigley.
Got the split in Wrigley, which is what you want to do on the road. Yeah.
Yeah, of course.
So now they moved over to Comiskey. It was Saturday, October 10th. The weather was kind of cool. It was 47 degrees. Cubs and the Sox lineups remained pretty much the same. So the Cubs starter was a guy named Bob Buell, who was a 15-game winner in 1964. He had World Series experience. So he had played in 1957 and 1958 in the World Series for the Milwaukee Braves. And Joe Harlan was the starter for the Sox in game number 3. And so once again, in game number 3, the Brock-Hubbs combo started off strong. So in the top of the first, Brock singled to center, stole second base. Hubbs grounded to second, moved Brock to third. Billy Williams drove him in with a double for a 1-0 lead. But then in the bottom of the inning, the Sox second baseman, Don Buford, who you mentioned earlier.
Don Buford, yes.
Ended up playing with the Orioles. He smacked a solo homer to tie the game. And then Camilo Carrion in the bottom of the second got a single to left. Joe Harlan, who batted only 159 for the year, surprised everyone with a single. Now, interestingly, in those days, sometimes the pitchers hit surprisingly well in the World Series, as the opposing pitchers generally hadn't seen them before.
Sure.
So, we may remember Ken Holtzman when he went to the Oakland A's and pitched in the World Series. I mean, he had some great years at the plate in the World Series for the Oakland A's.
Yes, he was a really good hitter. You're right, Bill.
Because these pitchers, didn't really know how to set these guys up, and so sometimes pitchers did really well at the plate in the World Series. So anyway, in the third inning, Pete Ward hits a home run for the White Sox. Ken Hubbs gets a walk later in the game. Billy Williams doubles to drive him in. And so basically, Sox have a 5-2 lead. Hoyt Wilhelm comes in. So Cubs score a run, but and they get a few guys on base, and so Billy Williams almost hits one out, and Tom McCraw catches a long Williams fly at the warning track in left field, and so the final is Sox 5, Cubs 4. So the Sox take a 2-1 game
lead, and now of course, we are at Comiskey now. Yes.
Yeah, we are. So
okay.
So the Sox are up 2-1. So game 4 is an interesting one. So the Sox use their 4th starter, John Buzzhart, who used to play for the Cubs. So manager Lopez kind of figured that Buzzhart would know a thing or two about pitching to the Cubs.
William, is Buzzhart a right-hander? I don't remember. I mean, I remember Pizarro, of course, being a lefty. I was wondering. I want to say Buzzhart was a right-hander, but I couldn't remember.
Yeah, let me check here.
Yeah, just I am trying, because I know he went on to somebody else after it. I thought I saw him in the late 60s.
Yeah, so Buzzhart went on to Baltimore and Houston after that.
Yes.
I believe he's a righty. My statistics that I have here don't say, but
I get him always confused with Don Notabart.
Yeah, Don Notabart was with the Cubs in '69. He was one of, he's a guy who could have been pretty good coming out the bullpen, but Leo DeRocher, Regan, he actually had a good bullpen that year with Hanky Gary.
Yes.
Don
Abernathy.
that Abernathy, and he just
Sure.
didn't use those guys enough. And it was okay in 69 because Regan had a good season in 69,
sure.
but in 70, the Cubs foolishly traded Abernathy away, and he ended up, having a stellar year for the Kansas City Royals in the bullpen that year.
Yeah.
And I think if the Cubs would have kept Abernathy in 70, I think they would have
Sure.
been.
Oh my God, that would have been something. But I'll let you get back now to this game here. Yes.
So anyway, Cubs go back to Dick Ellsworth. So it was not unusual up until like really throughout the 60s that teams would go with three-man rotations. So we saw, the Cubs do that a lot in the late 60s. We had Jenkins, Holtzman, and Hands. Dick Selma was the fourth starter, but he wasn't always in there in 69, particularly early in the 69 season and in the 70 season. Leo went with a three-man rotation because there's a lot of days off early in the season, because they're worried about rainouts. And so, that let them go with a three-man rotation. And so, you got the day off in the World Series. So the Cubs went with the three-man rotation too. And so you've got Ellsworth pitching for the Cubs. You've got Buzzard pitching for the White Sox. Game was scoreless until the top of the fourth when the Cubs took a 3-0 lead. So in the sixth, Don Buford, he's batting .444 in the series by this time. So he's having a good series. Now, he wasn't always in here. So, Al Lopez, platooned him with Al Weiss. And so Buford was actually pinch hitting here. And he got hit by a pitch to become the Sox second base runner. But he didn't score. In the seventh, Ellsworth hit McCraw with a pitch for the Sox fourth base runner of the day, but he didn't score either. So now going into the bottom of the ninth, Ellsworth has a no-hitter going in the World Series because the Sox were a pretty light hitting team and Ellsworth was really good. So, would it be only the second no-hitter in World Series history? So Robinson leads off for the White Sox, grounds out to second base. Hansen pops out to Sano at third. So it's only Moose Skowron that stands between Ellsworth and World Series history. And unfortunately, the history would be a little different than Cub fans hope. So Skowron singled to break up the no-hitter. Ward singled to center. McCraw singled to right. So with the no-hitter gone and Ellsworth struggling, Bob Kennedy brought in Lindy McDaniel. So
the righty.
Lindy McDaniel was the Cubs' top closer of 63. Struggled a little in 64, but he still racked up 16 saves that year. So he would have been the guy. And so, Cubs would have ended up winning that game, but it was nearly a no-hitter for Ellsworth. So that would have been a very exciting one. Lost in the hoopla over the World Series, no-hitter. Ernie Banks went 4 for 4 in that game with 2 doubles, and Lou Brock stole another base. So the Cubs hitting continued, and when Ellsworth came through, the Cubs did really well. So now the series is tied.
We are at 2-2 right now. Yes, exactly.
And so they're go to Game 5 at Comiskey, and so Carrion, the catcher, he wasn't having that good of a series, so he was in there for his bat, but since he wasn't really doing that well, Lopez decided to bring in J.C. Martin. So Martin was in the game. You've got Larry Jackson going for the Cubs again. You've got Gary Peters going for the White Sox. Game was 60 degrees, and here we go with the Brock-Hubbs connection again. So Brock gets a single, the infield single to short. Hubbs bloops a single to left. Brock makes it to third. Hubbs tries to steal second, but was thrown out by Martin, who was the stronger defensive catcher. But Williams then scored single to right to score Brock for 1-0 lead. Cubs take a 2-0 lead. Billy Williams homers in the third. It's 3-0. Banks hits a homer in the sixth, so it's 4-0. Jackson sailing along until the bottom of the seventh. So Pete Ward doubles to right. Moose Skowron drives him third. Ron Hansen drives him home with a ground out. So the Cubs end up winning that game 4-1. So now the Cubs are up in the World Series 3-2.
And we're going back to Wrigley.
They're going back to Wrigley, yeah. So the Cubs can wrap it up in Game 6, but as we talked about before, since it goes to Game 7, that wasn't going to happen. So actually, in Game 6, the Sox had their best game of the entire World Series. It was a great day. It was 68 degrees. Juan Pizarro was back on the mound. He just had a a fantastic World Series for him. And so it starts out, the Sox hitting starts out in the fourth. Floyd Robinson, who was a good hitter, lines a single to right. Moose Gowan doubles down the left field line to score Robinson. Hanson singles to right, so he scores Gowan for a 2-0 lead. Pizarro in the fifth gets a hit. These pitchers, it seems odd that the computer would do this, but like I said, pitchers often did well in the World Series because the opposing pitchers just weren't used to seeing these guys.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
I actually remember after the 69 season, NBC ran a computerized game between the 1951 New York Giants and the 1969 New York Mets, and they actually had some of the Mets and the Giants there in the booth to comment on what the computer was showing.
Wow.
So the computer, so it's not just the What If Sports computer, but the NBC computer had Tom Seaver hitting a home run off of Sal Magley, and
Oh,
Magley
wow.
was in the booth, and Magley did not like that at all.
Yeah, Magley was like Drysdale. He'd hit you the next time.
They called him the barber because he always
The barber, right? Sal Magley.
Yeah. So anyway, so we've got Pizarro doing pretty well. Sox take a 3-0 lead. In the sixth, the Sox load the bases, and in what I call the most stunning moment of the World Series, Pizarro hits a grand slam.
Oh, wow.
In right field, and he could have done it. I mean, he was a good hitting pitcher, and he ended up with the Cubs. In 1970, 71, he worked himself into the Cub rotation, and
I can still see him, number 46 on the Cubs.
Exactly. Yeah. He's kind of a heavy set guy by that time. As he got older, he didn't. And Pizarro was known, like I say in my book, he was known for drinking, eating, and carousing. So he enjoyed himself. But sometimes those heavy guys, they've got the pop to hit it out the park.
You know what, Bill, real quick, he reminds me of the modern day Bartolo Colon.
Oh yeah. Exactly.
So we're still in game 6 here.
Yeah. So anyway, in the ninth inning, the Cubs have their only offensive highlight of the day. Right fielder Lou Brock hits a home run. So again, Brock comes through. It's not just about singles and stealing bases. So the Sox win 7-1. So the Sox have their best game of the World Series. It was the Cubs' worst game of the World Series. So that ended the Cubs' momentum there, and so now we go to game 7, which
and now William Bike is going to set the stage here.
Exactly. So it's the first ever 7th game of the World Series between the two teams, because the 1906 World Series had only gone 6 games. So the place was Wrigley Field. The temperature was perfect 72 degrees. So it was a great day for a World Series. So the Sox start Joe Horlin. The Cubs bring Dick Ellsworth back again. Wow. This was not unusual. So there were 11 pitchers. There were 10 pitchers in the World Series up in that time to have won 3 games in the same World Series. The Milwaukee Braves, Lou Burdette did it in 1957, so that wasn't that long ago. So, Ellsworth comes in, so Bob Kennedy makes a few changes. So catcher Dick Bertel, not a big name anyway. He was only hitting 136 in the series. So Kennedy starts backup catcher, a guy named Jimmy Schaefer, and moves up Andre Rogers, who'd been batting 7th or 8th, but he was hitting 318 in the series by that time. So he moves up to 6th place in the lineup. Center fielder Burton goes to the 7th spot. Anyway, game scoreless until the bottom of the 3rd. Center fielder Ellis Burton comes out of his mini slump, and he hits a homer to right field that barely cleared the wall, but that's a 1-0 lead. Bottom of the 6th, Cub pitcher Dick Ellsworth singles. So this computer just loves those hitting pitchers, and so Ellsworth gets a single. Lou Brock walks. Ken Hubbs flies out to right, but left fielder Billy Williams doubles to left to drive in Ellsworth and Brock. After a ground out by Sano, Ernie hits a fly ball to center fielder Mike Hirschberger, but Hirschberger makes an error, so now the Cubs are up 4-0. They take a 5-0 lead, and so they're going into the top of the 9th with a 5-0 lead, and the Sox aren't ready to give up yet. So So third baseman Pete Ward hits a homer to left center field. Moose Gowan fouls with a single. Back in those days, the managers didn't necessarily lift starters when they were getting into trouble late in the game. So Kennedy left Ellsworth in. So Sox shortstop Ron Hansen flies out to left field. Hirschberger hits into a fielder's choice, and that leaves the Cubs only 1 out away from their first World Series win since 1908. Camilo Carrion's back in the lineup as the catcher. It's a ground ball to shortstop Andre Rogers, who threw to first baseman Ernie Banks for the final out of a 5-1 victory. And
Wow.
the Cubs were the world champions of 1964.
And you know what, Bill? When you were talking, I was kind of just looking at my notes and looking at this lineup, and of course, we're how we kind of broke this up, broke it open tonight. You know what? On paper, when you look at that 64 Cup team and what we inserted and everything else, and I look at that White Sox team that won 98 games, I didn't think that on paper, the White Sox looked terrible in the sense of what they had, where the Cubs, I think, had the depth.
Yeah, Cubs had the depth, and guys are having great seasons. Sano had a great season in 64. Williams had a great season in 64. Larry Jackson, who was the Cubs' second starter behind Ellsworth, I mean, he had a career year in 64 too. So, think about it. I mean, Ken Hubbs not only was a great player, but he was a great guy. He's very popular with the guys.
Oh, yeah.
In fact, like I said in an earlier podcast that I was on, Sano and Ken Hubbs were good friends. And so Sano was just devastated when Hubbs passed away. And, even went to talk to his priest about it, because Sano just could not understand why such a good person, had died so young. And so these guys in 64 were pretty demoralized. But, you put, Brock and Hubbs at the beginning of that lineup with the great seasons those guys had in 64 anyway. And, like I said, like we talked about before, Cardinals only won 93 games to win the pennant that year. So could the Cubs have won 93 or 94 with that lineup? Absolutely.
Oh, yeah, it was a great lineup. I mean, when you told me we were going to do this 64, and just, and I really hope our audience zooms in on some of what you broke down with the play-by-play of those 7 games. I mean, that, hey, we're talking, what was that game 7 would have been played in 64? What was that day again?
That would have been, let's see, that would have been Thursday, October 15th, 1964.
Okay, so we are talking, 60 years ago and 1 week now that game would have been played. I mean, it seems like yesterday when we talk about the 60s, but 60 years ago and 1 week. Listen, I really want to thank you for breaking this down the way you did. At first, I thought, okay, 64, but when you go back and look at some of these names and the players and the history, and by the way, I want to tell our audience, Bill, by the way he describes things is he could have wrote another book here tonight. But if you want to see pretty much like on a Wikipedia or something, all the players that Bill has mentioned tonight, William Bike has mentioned, are there. And they talk about trades and everything and posturing and everything and games. They even bring up the games won and lost. And my friend, you were spot on as always. And again, I really want to thank you for doing this, because this was great. I mean, to go back to what could have been. And I got to tell you something. You're going to answer me one question tonight. I still say the worst trade in modern sports doesn't happen with, I'll say Lou Brock and Ernie Broglio is second. But will you agree with me that the Chicago Blackhawks, when they traded Phil Esposito, reminds me of the Lou Brock, Ernie Broglio for Pitt Martin?
You're absolutely correct, because think about how close the Blackhawks came in 1971.
Yes.
Went down to the 7th game of the Stanley Cup Finals and ended up losing that game. What was it, 4-3?
To the Montreal Canadiens, yes.
So, put Phil Esposito in that lineup, they're going to do better. And people don't remember that even with Bobby Hull gone to the World Hockey Association 2 years later, the Blackhawks made the Stanley Cup Finals 2 years later, too, in 73.
In that 72-73 season, you're right, Bill.
So,
Bill,
again, put Phil Esposito in that lineup, and they're going to do something.
Well, listen, I really want to thank you for tonight. This was great. We're going to get this out to our audience on YouTube and Spotify. Probably this will be out by the weekend, by Friday or Saturday. This was great. I want everybody to remember this great book. I have 2 copies of this, Bill. I always have the one that I don't want to touch and the one that I read, The Forgotten 1970 Chicago Cubs, Go and Glow, William S. Pike. It is a great book. And if you really go back to 1970 and the way this gentleman has depicted this team, it really was, Bill, better than the 60-19.
They were. They had Joe Pepitone. They had Milt Pappas. That alone made them a better team.
And they were 5.5 out at the end. They could have won that. They could have won it in September.
Oh
easily.
yeah. Billy Williams had his career year, and Jim Hickman did too. So when you got 2 guys having their career years like that, you know, they should have done it.
Yeah. William, I truly thank you. And I know we're going to see each other down the road for another one. Good night. And thank you, Bill.
Good night, John. This was a lot of fun. Thank you.
A lot of fun. Thank you.
Available now at Amazon and everywhere books are sold online. Siciliana. Siciliana is a captivating novel that embodies the ferocity of a woman wronged while contemplating complex questions of home and country. This thrilling story of a 13th century Sicilian revolution will dazzle fans of historical fiction. You will find much here to relish, tremble at, and in the end, cheer. Purchase your copy today.
Let's go. Batter up. We're taking the afternoon off. It's a beautiful day for a ball game. For a ball game today. The fans are out to get a ticket or 2 from